The Hells Angels biker found the little girl hiding under a broken RV, and his violent rescue ended a predator's hunt. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold, rainy evening, the kind of night when the streets are empty and only the brave or the foolish are out on the roads. Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, was cruising along the back roads of Northern California. His leather jacket flapped in the wind as he steered his Harley-Davidson through the rain, headlights cutting through the thick fog. It had been a long day, and all Jake wanted was to get home to the quiet of his garage. But as the headlights of his bike pierced the mist, a faint sound caught his attention. It was distant at first, but then it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of a child's cry. He slammed the brakes and turned sharply, his bike fishtailing slightly on the slick road as he tried to locate the source of the noise. Just ahead, near the edge of a broken-down RV, a small figure huddled beneath it. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog, but as he got closer, the figure shifted, revealing a young girl, no older than 7 or 8. Her clothes were ragged, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She was trembling, her small body barely visible in the shadows of the broken vehicle. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with fear, as though she were unsure whether to trust the large, intimidating figure on the roaring motorcycle. Jake's heart clenched. He was no stranger to violence, but seeing a child in distress hit him harder than anything he had ever experienced. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, to ride away and leave the situation behind. But something inside him, something buried deep, told him to stop. Without thinking, he kicked his bike into neutral and dismounted. The sound of the engine cutting off was immediately replaced by the steady patter of the rain. Jake took a step toward the girl, his boots making soft thuds against the wet ground. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but softer than usual. The girl recoiled, her wide eyes filled with terror as she backed further under the RV. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, barely audible. Jake froze. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had been hurt, someone who had learned to fear the world. He kneeled down slowly, careful not to appear threatening. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said gently, trying to reassure her. His mind flashed to memories of his own childhood, memories of times when he was the one hiding from danger. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offering one to the girl as a sign of peace. "You're safe now," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it himself. The girl eyed him suspiciously, but after a long moment, she inched forward. "What's your name?" Jake asked, his voice softening even more. She hesitated, but finally replied, "Sophie." "Sophie," Jake repeated, nodding. "All right, Sophie, I'm not gonna hurt you. You're just scared, and that's okay. We'll get you out of here." Sophie finally crawled out from under the RV, her tiny body shaking. Jake didn't waste any time. He could tell she was in bad shape, hungry, cold, and likely injured. He picked her up gently, cradling her in his arms. As he stood up, his eyes scanned the area. There were no signs of anyone else around, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as if danger was still lurking nearby. "I'm gonna take you somewhere safe, all right?" he said as he mounted his bike, carefully placing Sophie in front of him. She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but she didn't resist. With a grunt, Jake revved the engine and took off, determined to get the little girl to safety. What he didn't know, as he rode through the rain-soaked streets, was that Sophie's nightmare was far from over. As Jake's mind raced, he felt an unsettling presence following them in the shadows. A predator was still out there, and he was about to learn just how dangerous it could be to cross paths with someone like him. But that would have to wait. For now, Jake had one mission, to protect Sophie from whatever horrors awaited her. And in that moment, he was willing to fight, even if it meant risking everything. I could feel Sophie's tiny body shivering against me as we rode through the rain. The storm was relentless, the kind that soaked you to the bone in seconds. Her grip tightened on my jacket as we sped through the wet streets of the small town. I had no idea what had happened to her before she ended up under that RV. But one thing was clear, she was running from something far worse than just the rain. I wasn't sure what I had gotten myself into, but I was damn sure I wasn't going to let anything happen to her now. I pulled into the first gas station I could find, my Harley screeching as I slid to a stop. The place was nearly deserted, with the exception of a lone truck parked by the pump. Sophie stayed close to me as I got off the bike, still shaking from the cold and fear. I walked inside, hoping the place had a phone or maybe a blanket to warm her up. The gas station attendant was a young guy, probably in his 20s, with messy brown hair and a nervous look in his eyes. "Hey, man, you got a blanket or something? My kid's freezing," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He nodded, stepping away from the counter and into the back room. I looked down at Sophie, who was clinging to my leather jacket as though it were the only thing holding her together. "Hey, you okay?" I asked softly, crouching down to her level. She nodded slightly, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was trying to act brave, but there was no hiding the trauma that had been done to her. She hadn't just run away from someone. She had escaped something far darker, and I needed to know what. The attendant came back with an old, worn blanket, handing it to me without a word. I wrapped it around Sophie, gently tugging her closer to me. Her body felt fragile, like it could shatter. "If I wasn't careful." "Thank you," I muttered, and turned to leave. Just as I was walking out, I saw a familiar face, a face I never expected to see at a place like this. A man I had known from the old days, someone who should have stayed out of my life. It was Vince, a former Hells Angels member, someone who had always been a bit too shady for my taste. "Reaper," he called, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "What are you doing with the kid?" He motioned towards Sophie, who was now clinging to my side, her face still pale. I stepped in front of her protectively, blocking his view. "Mind your business, Vince," I growled, my grip tightening on the handle of the door. I knew Vince. He had always been the type to take advantage of situations, and I wasn't about to let him do that with Sophie. He smirked, taking a step closer. "You're walking a fine line, Reaper. I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but the kid's not your responsibility." I didn't respond, keeping my gaze steady. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. He wasn't the kind of man I had been in the past. Not anymore. "Get lost," I said, my voice low and steady. Vince's smirk faltered as he realized I wasn't backing down. He turned on his heel and walked out the door, disappearing into the night like a shadow. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and turned back to Sophie. She was staring at me, her big eyes filled with questions. I could see she wanted to ask about the man, but she was too scared to. I kneeled down in front of her, giving her a reassuring smile. "He's nobody," I said softly, "but we're going to be all right. I'll protect you. You're safe now." She nodded, her lips trembling. I stood up and motioned for her to follow me. We needed to get out of here, but I didn't know where to go. I couldn't take her back to my place just yet. I had no idea who might be looking for her. The rain showed no sign of letting up, but I wasn't going to stop now. We were a long way from being safe. As I started the bike, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea who had been after Sophie, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. And I wasn't about to let her face it alone. I kept the throttle steady as the rain kept pouring, the sound of the engine roaring louder than the storm around us. Sophie was still holding on to me, wrapped tightly in the blanket, her small body trembling against mine as we rode through the night. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that felt off, like the calm before a storm. I had no idea what had happened to her, but I knew one thing for sure. Whoever had hurt her wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And I wasn't about to let that happen. We had to get out of this town. Sophie didn't speak as we drove, but I could feel her clinging to me with every mile, like she knew that she was safer with me. I had no plan, no destination, but something in me told me to keep going, to stay ahead of whatever danger was closing in on us. We passed through the outskirts of town, and I pulled the bike off the main road, into an old, run-down motel parking lot. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. I didn't trust the town anymore, and I definitely didn't trust Vince or anyone else from the past. The last thing I wanted was for Sophie to get caught up in something worse than what she had already been through. I parked the bike and helped Sophie off, making sure she was steady on her feet. The place was deserted, the neon sign flickering in the rain. I paid for a room, and quickly led Sophie inside. The room was small, with threadbare carpets and a musty smell that hit me as soon as the door opened. But it was safe. For now. Sophie looked around, her eyes wide, taking in her surroundings. "Are we okay?" she asked in a soft voice, barely above a whisper. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it hit me harder than I expected. She had been through hell, and here I was, trying to be her protector. But the truth was, I didn't have all the answers. "We're okay," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. I helped her sit on the bed, then took off my leather jacket and hung it on the back of the door. I wasn't used to looking after anyone, let alone a kid, but I wasn't about to let her down now. "I'll go grab us some food," I said, trying to sound casual. Sophie nodded but didn't say anything. I left the room, my mind racing. I needed to figure out who was after Sophie, what they wanted, and how to get her out of this mess. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. I stepped out into the rain, the cold air biting at my skin. The diner down the street had closed, and there was no sign of any other places open this late. I wasn't worried about food for myself, but Sophie needed something to eat, something to keep her strong. As I walked back to the motel, I noticed a figure standing by the shadows of the street lamp, a familiar silhouette. My hand instinctively moved to the knife at my belt, but I didn't draw it. I knew who it was before I even reached him. It was Vince again. "You're not fooling anyone, Reaper," Vince said, his voice low and gravelly, almost a sneer. "I saw you take the kid. You can't just hide her away." My heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at me to walk away. But I didn't. "What do you want, Vince?" I asked, my voice steady. He stepped forward, his hands in his jacket pockets. "I just want to talk," he said, but there was a dangerous edge to his words. "You don't understand, Reaper. That kid's got a price on her head." A chill ran down my spine. "What the hell are you talking about?" I growled, narrowing my eyes. Vince smirked. "She's not just some runaway, man. She's connected. You're in way deeper than you think." That was all I needed to hear. I grabbed Vince by the collar, slamming him into the wall of the motel. "If you're lying to me, Vince, I swear I'll." I stopped myself, my breath heavy with anger. Vince's eyes were wide with shock, but there was a glint of something else in them. Fear. "I'm not lying," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I wouldn't be here if I was. There's people after her, Reaper. Dangerous people. And if you're not careful, you're going to end up in a hole right next to her." I released him, letting him stumble back onto his feet. I couldn't let that happen. Not to her. Not to me. I stepped back, taking a deep breath, my mind whirling with the new information. "Stay the hell away from us, Vince," I said, my voice cold. Vince nodded quickly and disappeared into the night, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I went back to the room, my mind still racing. Sophie was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts. I closed the door behind me and took a seat across from her. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone gentle. She looked at me, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What's going to happen to me now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have the answer. I didn't know what was coming, but I was going to do everything I could to make sure she was safe. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice as reassuring as I could make it. "You're not alone anymore. I promise." As I sat there, my thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from outside. My body tensed, and I stood up, walking to the window. The street was empty, but something about the silence made my heart race. The storm had made the world feel even quieter, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the faint sound of distant footsteps. Whoever was after Sophie wasn't far behind, and I had no intention of letting them catch up. I stood by the window, my eyes scanning the empty parking lot under the dim glow of the streetlight. The storm had died down to a light drizzle, but the tension in the air felt thicker than ever. Sophie was asleep on the bed, wrapped in the blanket I had found for her earlier. She had finally relaxed after hours of fear and uncertainty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Someone was after her, and I wasn't about to let them find her. Not on my watch. The door creaked open behind me, and I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. But it wasn't Vince this time. It was the motel manager, a man who looked too tired to be bothered by anything. But there was something in his eyes that told me he knew more than he let on. "You're the guy with the kid, right?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's it to you?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "There's people asking about her," he said, his voice hushed. "I don't want any trouble. Just keep her quiet, all right?" My eyes narrowed. "Who's asking about her?" I growled. He hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice further. "I don't know for sure, but they're not the kind of people you want to mess with. Just get out of here before they come looking." The warning hit me harder than I expected. I didn't trust this guy, but I wasn't about to take any chances with Sophie's safety. I stepped toward the door, blocking his exit. "Who are they?" I demanded. He looked around nervously, then sighed. "The men who've been asking about her. They're connected to something bigger. Trust me, you don't want to get tangled up in this." He hesitated for a second before adding, "You don't know who you're dealing with, man." I was done with his cryptic nonsense. "Get out," I said, my voice cold. "And if you know what's good for you, you won't mention her again. Ever." The manager didn't argue. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. I slammed the door shut behind him, my mind racing. Whoever was after Sophie wasn't just a random thug. They were connected to something much darker, something that I had no intention of getting involved in. But now I didn't have a choice. I had to protect her. Sophie needed to be safe, and I was the only one who could make sure that happened. I walked back to the bed and crouched down beside her. She was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in hours. Her small form, wrapped in the blanket, looked so vulnerable, and I hated the thought that someone could be out there, hunting her. I wasn't going to let that happen. I wouldn't let her down. The door to the motel room burst open without warning, and I spun around, my body tensing. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. A tall man in a dark jacket stood in the doorway, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I was already moving, my hand reaching for the knife, but the man held up his hand in a calming gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice smooth and deep. "But I'm here for her." My pulse raced. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my hand still on the knife. "Just a guy who knows what's going on," he replied, his voice still calm. "And I'm here to make sure she's protected." I stepped in front of Sophie, my body blocking the man's view of her. "Not a chance," I said, my voice low and dangerous. The man didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't understand," he said. "She's already in danger. And the people coming for her won't stop until they get what they want." I felt my blood run cold. The man wasn't lying. I could see it in his eyes. Whoever was after Sophie was ruthless. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to control my anger. "I want to make sure she's safe," he said. "And I want to help you protect her. You can't do this alone." I shook my head. "I don't trust you," I growled. "I don't need anyone else getting involved." The man's eyes softened. "You do," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "She's in more danger than you realize. You can't fight this battle by yourself." I didn't know what to make of the man, but I knew one thing for sure. Sophie's safety was my responsibility now. I couldn't afford to take chances. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" I asked, still keeping my distance. "Because I'm here to help you," he replied. "And I've been where you are. I know what it's like to protect someone who needs it." There was something about the way he said it, something that made me believe him. "Fine," I said reluctantly, my hand finally leaving the knife. "But if you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it." The man nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I understand. Let's get her out of here before it's too late." I turned to Sophie, who was still sleeping soundly on the bed, unaware of the danger lurking outside. My heart ached for her, for everything she had already been through. But I wasn't about to let her face this alone. I would do whatever it took to keep her safe. And with that, the man stepped aside, allowing me to take the lead. We had a long road ahead of us, but I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. I didn't trust the man who had just entered our lives, but I had no choice. Sophie was still asleep on the bed, unaware of the danger that was now closing in on her. I glanced back at the man, his dark eyes holding steady as he stood in the doorway. "You know what's going on, don't you?" I asked, my voice low and wary. "You wouldn't be here if you didn't." He nodded slowly, stepping closer into the room. "There's a lot more going on than you think," he said, his voice calm, but heavy with something that felt like caution. "The people after Sophie aren't just random thugs. They're part of a bigger operation." I straightened, my hand instinctively moving to the knife at my belt. "What kind of operation?" I demanded. He looked at Sophie, then back to me. It's a trafficking ring, he said quietly. The kind that uses kids like her for all the wrong reasons. My blood ran cold. The thought of anyone hurting her made my stomach churn. So, what's your plan? I asked, trying to mask the anger in my voice. The man paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to the window before he spoke again. We need to move her. The longer she stays here, the more dangerous it gets for both of you. I know a safe house nearby, but we'll have to leave now. I felt a pit in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spinning out of control, but I had no time to waste. Every second we stayed in this room was a second closer to danger. I'll follow your lead, I said reluctantly, still not sure if I could trust him. But if you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it. He gave me a curt nod. Understood. Let's go. I went over to the bed and gently shook Sophie awake. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. We need to leave, Sophie, I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm for her sake. I know it's scary, but you're safe now. She nodded hesitantly, her small hand reaching out to mine. The man stood by the door, waiting. Hurry, he urged. We didn't have much time. I took Sophie's hand and led her out of the room, my eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. As we moved through the motel, I felt like we were walking through a tunnel with no way out. The hallway was dim, the lights flickering as we passed, but the stillness felt unnatural, like the calm before the storm. The man led the way, his steps silent as he moved toward the exit. I followed closely, my senses on high alert. Every shadow, every sound made me tense. We reached the parking lot, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The storm had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The man motioned toward a beat-up van parked by the far end of the lot. Get in, he said, opening the side door. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to be careful. But Sophie was with me, and I had to protect her. I couldn't take any chances. We climbed into the van, and the man slammed the door shut behind us. He started the engine, and we pulled out of the lot without a word. The van lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven pavement. I looked out the back window, but I couldn't see anything following us. That didn't mean we were safe. Not yet. We drove for what felt like hours, the city lights fading as we went deeper into the countryside. I kept my eyes on the man, trying to gauge whether I could trust him. He hadn't given me much information, but his actions seemed sincere enough. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man glanced at me in the rearview mirror. We're almost there, he said, his voice steady. But once we get to the safe house, you'll have to lay low. It's the only way to stay off the radar. I nodded, trying to focus on Sophie, who was curled up beside me, her small frame shaking slightly. What happens after we get there? I asked. Do we just stay hidden forever? The man's expression hardened. Not forever. But the longer you're here, the more likely it is that they'll find you. And when they do, it'll be worse than anything you've faced so far. I didn't want to imagine what he meant, but I knew he was right. Sophie couldn't stay in hiding forever. I couldn't keep running from this forever. I glanced at her, wondering how much longer she could handle the fear, the uncertainty. The man wasn't wrong. We couldn't just wait it out. We had to find a way to end this, once and for all. After another hour of driving, the van slowed and turned off the main road. We drove down a narrow dirt path, the trees on either side blocking most of the light. Finally, we pulled up to a small, secluded house hidden deep in the woods. It looked like a rundown cabin, but it was sturdy, and that's all that mattered. The man turned off the engine and looked at me. Stay close, he said, his voice now tinged with urgency. We need to move quickly. They know we're here. My heart skipped a beat. Who knows? I asked, my voice tight with fear. How do they know? He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting around the surroundings. Doesn't matter, he said finally. What matters is getting inside and staying alive. We all got out of the van, and I took Sophie's hand again, leading her toward the cabin. As we neared the door, the sound of footsteps from behind us sent a chill through my spine. I didn't know who was following us, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I could hear the crunch of footsteps behind us as we reached the door of the cabin, my heart pounding harder with each step. We had just barely made it here, and now it felt like the storm was catching up with us. The man led the way, his hand on the door handle, but something in his demeanor shifted, his shoulders tense. Stay close, he said, his voice low and urgent. We don't have much time. I gripped Sophie's hand tighter, feeling her small fingers trembling in mine. She was scared, I could tell, but there was something else there too. A determination, like she understood that things had changed, that we were on the edge of something bigger than either of us. The man pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. The air was thick with the scent of wood and old dust, but there was a warmth to it, a feeling of safety. He stepped inside first, motioning for us to follow. As we crossed the threshold, I heard it. A soft noise, almost like a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The door slammed shut behind us, and I instinctively turned, scanning the area. It was too quiet, too still. What is it? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer at first. He was focused, listening, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Someone's here, he finally said, his voice strained. We need to move, now. He turned to me, his face suddenly stern. Get Sophie somewhere safe. Now. I looked at Sophie, her wide eyes reflecting the fear I felt, and nodded. Come on, Sophie, I said softly, guiding her to the farthest corner of the cabin, as far from the door as I could get. The man moved quickly, his steps steady and calculated as he pulled a small flashlight from his jacket. The low beam cut through the darkness, revealing the outline of furniture and what looked like old wooden crates stacked against the walls. The man motioned to one of the crates. Hide in there, he ordered. I hesitated for a moment, but then I saw the urgency in his eyes. I didn't have time to question him. I helped Sophie crawl into the crate, the wood creaking under her weight. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and scared. Don't leave me, she whispered. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile. I won't, I promised, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Stay quiet, okay? We'll be all right. As soon as Sophie was hidden, I turned to face the man. He had already moved to the window, peering out cautiously through the thin gaps in the old wooden blinds. Who's coming? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer at first. He was scanning the darkness outside, his hand resting on his belt. I could see the outline of something. A gun perhaps, but I didn't ask. I didn't need to. They've been tracking you, he said finally, his voice grim. They know you're here. I stepped forward, my heart racing. Who are they? I asked. What do they want with Sophie? He turned to face me, his eyes hardening. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. They're part of a larger group. Criminals, traffickers. They have their hooks in a lot of things. And they won't stop until they get what they want. I could feel the weight of his words sink into my chest, the gravity of the situation settling in. My first instinct was to protect Sophie, to get her out of here, but I knew now that leaving wasn't enough. Not anymore. What happens now? I asked, my voice low. We fight, he said. We hold this place. They'll come for us. We can't run anymore. I nodded, the realization hitting me harder than I wanted to admit. I wasn't just protecting Sophie anymore. I was protecting myself, my past, everything I had been running from for years. There was no more hiding. It was time to face whatever came next. We waited in silence, the tension in the air almost unbearable. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Sophie was still in the crate, silent as death itself, but I could hear her breathing, the slight rasp of it in the stillness of the cabin. Outside, the world was quiet, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the roof. But I knew that wouldn't last. The man stood near the window, his eyes trained on the shadows outside. He was waiting for something, or someone. Get ready, he muttered. It's almost time. I positioned myself behind a table, trying to steady my breathing, my mind racing. I couldn't help but wonder how I had gotten here. How Sophie had gotten here. All of it. This life, this fight, had come crashing down in a matter of days. But I wasn't going to let her down. I wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. The cabin door creaked. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, making their way toward us. They were here. I gripped the knife at my belt, my mind sharp, focused. There was no turning back now. The man gave me a quick glance, his hand reaching for his gun. Stay close, he said, and don't make a sound. I nodded. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let them take Sophie. Not without a fight. I could hear the footsteps growing louder outside, the sound of boots slapping against the wet earth. They were closing in. My heartbeat quickened, my grip tightening around the knife at my belt. I glanced at the man standing near the window, his eyes locked on the shadows outside, waiting. Are you ready? He asked, his voice steady but low. I nodded, my muscles tensed, ready for whatever was coming. Sophie was still hidden in the crate, her breathing shallow but even. I had told her to stay quiet, and she was doing her best to follow my orders. The man shifted slightly, his hand resting on the gun at his side, his posture alert. He was ready, but the question was I? The cabin was silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant crackle of thunder. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. We were about to face something, or someone, that could change everything. The door creaked again, and I stiffened. I wasn't sure how many of them there were, but I knew it wasn't just one. They had been tracking us for days, and now they were here. The man took a deep breath and moved toward the door, signaling for me to follow. I stepped forward, every sense on high alert. As I moved closer to the door, I heard it, a faint voice. "You can't hide forever, Reaper," it said, dripping with menace. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That voice was familiar. Too familiar. I knew that man. I'd run into him more than once in the past. He was a part of the gang that had been running the streets, and he wasn't someone I wanted to deal with now. "Stay behind me," the man beside me said, his voice calm but firm. "And don't let them know you're here. If they get inside, we're screwed." I nodded and stood back, watching as the man approached the door. He wasn't rushing. He was calm, calculating, like he had done this 1,000 times. I tried to steady my breathing, my mind racing. I had to keep it together. I had to protect Sophie. The door creaked open. Just a crack, and the man peered through. His eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a snarl. "We don't have time for this," he muttered, his voice low. "Get ready." Without another word, he swung the door wide open, stepping out into the night. I was right behind him, my knife in hand, ready for whatever was coming. The night air was thick with humidity, and the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the trees, but I was focused on the figures in front of me. There were 3 of them, all wearing dark jackets, their faces hidden beneath hoods. I could see the outline of a weapon in one of their hands. They weren't here for a friendly chat. "Looking for someone?" the man beside me called out, his voice steady, but with a hint of mockery. One of the figures stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long, Reaper," he said, his voice rough and cold. "Time to pay the price." I felt the tension in the air shift. The man beside me was ready, but I could tell this wasn't going to be easy. Not by a long shot. "You want to take a shot at me? Go ahead," the man said, stepping forward, his voice sharp. "But if you want the kid, you'll have to go through me first." The figure laughed, the sound grating against my nerves. "We're not interested in you anymore. It's her we want." The man's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You don't want to make this mistake," he said quietly, his voice cold. The figure nodded to the others, and just like that, the situation escalated. I could see one of them reach for a gun, and that's when everything exploded into chaos. The man beside me lunged forward, his body colliding with one of the attackers. There was a loud crack as the figure went down, but the other 2 were already moving toward us. I could hear the sound of a gunshot, the sharp crack splitting the night air. The bullet missed, but the warning was clear. They were playing for keeps. I rushed forward, knife in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to protect Sophie. I had to survive. The second figure swung a fist at me, but I ducked, spinning to the side and landing a quick punch to his gut. He grunted, stumbling back. But before I could move, the third attacker lunged toward me, aiming to pin me down. I reacted on instinct, slashing my knife across his arm, forcing him back. He roared in pain, clutching his bleeding arm. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, keep fighting. The man beside me was already on his feet, his fist connecting with one of the attacker's faces with a sickening thud. The other figure staggered back, but there was no time to celebrate. They weren't just going to back off. This wasn't over. Not yet. The attacker I had slashed at with my knife lunged forward again, but this time I was ready. I dodged his attack, spinning around and kicking him in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall of the cabin. He didn't get up. The man beside me didn't say anything, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was wounded, his face covered in bruises, but he wasn't backing down. Neither of us was. The remaining attacker stood there, looking between us and his fallen comrades. His eyes were wide with fear. "You want to try your luck?" I asked, my voice low, steady. The man swallowed, his hand shaking as he reached for his gun. I didn't wait. I moved in fast, catching him off guard and slamming him into the ground. The gun flew out of his hand, skidding across the dirt. I was on top of him before he could react, my knee pressing into his chest. "It's over," I said, my voice cold. "You and your friends need to get out of here." He nodded quickly, his breath ragged, and I got off of him. "Go," I ordered, watching as he scrambled to his feet. He didn't waste any time running into the night, disappearing into the trees. The man beside me breathed a sigh of relief, but I knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning, and there was still so much more to fight for. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart still racing from the fight. The cabin was eerily quiet now, except for the soft sound of rain falling against the roof. I could feel the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a deep, unsettling calm. We had survived the first wave, but I knew that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I looked at the man beside me. His clothes were torn, and his face was streaked with dirt and blood. He didn't say anything, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was a fighter, but even the toughest had their limits. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice low. He nodded, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice rough. "But we need to move fast. They'll be back with reinforcements." My eyes flicked to Sophie, still hidden in the crate in the corner of the room. She hadn't made a sound since the fight started, but I knew she was scared. She had been through so much already, and I wasn't sure how much more she could take. "Sophie," I called softly, my voice gentle but firm. "It's safe now. You can come out." She hesitated, then slowly crawled out of the crate, her small face pale and tear-streaked. She looked at me with wide eyes, full of fear and confusion. "Are they gone?" she asked in a tiny voice. I nodded, kneeling down to her level. "Yes, they're gone for now. But we need to stay quiet and stay safe." "Can you do that?" Sophie nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I couldn't blame her. She had been thrust into a nightmare, and I was the one responsible for getting her out of it. I stood up and looked at the man, who was already checking the door, making sure it was secure. "What now?" I asked. He didn't turn around at first. He was focused, listening to every sound outside. "Now we run," he said, his voice low. "We don't have much time before they come back. I know a place we can lay low." I glanced at Sophie again. "What about her? We can't just leave her alone." The man turned to face me, his expression serious. "She's not alone," he said. "Not while I'm here." I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't afford to break down now. Sophie needed me, and I needed to stay focused. "All right," I said. "Let's go." The man led the way, stepping cautiously toward the door. I followed closely. Behind, my eyes constantly scanning the room. I wasn't used to being on the run like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, but I couldn't afford to be caught off guard. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled by the rain outside. The man opened the door just enough to peek out, then motioned for me to follow. We stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung heavy in the sky, casting the world in shadows. The man led us through the woods behind the cabin, his pace quick but steady. I kept Sophie close, holding her hand as we moved through the dark trees. My mind raced, trying to figure out our next move. We had to get away, but where would we go? The man had promised safety, but I didn't know him, and I wasn't sure I could trust him completely. I had to, though. Sophie was counting on me. The man stopped abruptly, his body tense. He motioned for us to crouch down. "They're close," he whispered. I could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance, low and urgent. I grabbed Sophie's arm and pulled her behind a thick tree, pressing my back against the bark. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. The voices grew louder, closer. The man's eyes were narrowed, scanning the area. I followed his gaze, watching as figures began to emerge from the darkness, moving with purpose. They were searching for us. "Stay down," the man muttered. "Don't make a sound." We stayed frozen in place, the rain starting to pick up again. I could feel Sophie's body shaking beside me, her grip tightening on my hand. I squeezed her hand in reassurance, but I wasn't sure she felt safe. I wasn't sure I did either. The figures moved past us, their eyes scanning the trees, but they didn't stop. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they passed, and the man gave a small, relieved sigh. "We need to move," he said, standing up quickly. "Now." We ran again, faster this time, pushing through the underbrush as quietly as we could. My legs burned from the effort, but I didn't stop. Sophie was breathing hard beside me, her small feet struggling to keep up. I grabbed her hand and pulled her along, refusing to let her fall behind. The man led us through the trees, his pace quick but controlled. It wasn't long before we reached a clearing where a car was waiting. The man stopped and motioned for us to get in. I hesitated for a moment, but then I saw the urgency in his eyes. We didn't have time to question anything now. I helped Sophie into the car, then climbed in myself. The man slammed the door shut behind us, and before I could even catch my breath, the car started moving. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Somewhere safe," he replied, his tone serious. "But we're not out of danger yet." I looked back at Sophie, her small face pale and tired. She looked up at me with those big, scared eyes, and I could feel my heart break. I had to protect her. I had to make sure she got through this, whatever it took. As the car sped down the road, the sound of distant sirens could be heard in the background. The nightmare wasn't over, but I wasn't going to stop fighting until it was. Not now. Not ever. I sat in the back seat of the car, my mind racing as the tires hummed against the wet asphalt. Sophie sat next to me, her small body curled up against the door, her face pale and exhausted. She had been through so much, and I couldn't help but wonder how much more she could take. I wasn't sure how much more I could take, either. The car sped through the night, the darkness outside pressing in on us, and all I could think about was getting Sophie to safety. The man driving didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his expression grim. I didn't know his name, and I wasn't sure I trusted him completely, but I had to follow his lead. He had been right so far. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the danger we were in. I couldn't afford to question him now. As we drove, I noticed the tension in the air was thick. The closer we got to wherever this safe house was, the more anxious I became. What was waiting for us there? Were we really going to be safe? I glanced over at Sophie, her small hands clutching the blanket she had wrapped around herself. She looked up at me with wide eyes, her expression a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked in a small, shaky voice. I forced a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. "We're going to be fine," I said, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Sophie nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe me, not fully. How could she? She had been through so much already, and I had no idea what else was coming. I wanted to believe that we were safe, that everything was going to be all right. But deep down, I knew better. There was still too much we didn't know, too many unanswered questions. Who was after Sophie and why? Who were these people, and what did they want from her? I glanced at the man driving. He seemed to sense my unease. "We're almost there," he said without looking at me. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Just hang tight." I didn't answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We had just barely escaped the last group of men, and now we were headed straight into the unknown. As we turned onto a narrow dirt road, the car slowed. The man's grip tightened on the wheel, and I could see his eyes scanning the road ahead, alert and on edge. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. "We need to move quickly," he said, glancing at me. "Stay close to me, and keep Sophie quiet. We can't let anyone know where we're going." My heart sank. Are they following us? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed his foot down on the gas, and the car lurched forward. I could feel my pulse quicken, my nerves on edge. I held Sophie's hand tighter, trying to calm her, but I could feel her trembling beside me. We didn't speak for the next few minutes, the silence between us thick with tension. Finally, the man turned the car down a small, overgrown path, the headlights cutting through the trees. He slowed as we approached a small cabin in the distance, barely visible through the thick woods. I could see the outline of the structure, but it looked abandoned, like no one had lived there for years. The car came to a stop just outside, and the man turned off the engine. "We're here," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." We got out of the car, and I immediately felt the chill of the night air biting at my skin. I took Sophie's hand, and together we followed the man toward the cabin. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. This place didn't look safe. It didn't look like a place to hide from people who were hunting us. The man opened the door with a quick glance over his shoulder. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp. I didn't hesitate. I pulled Sophie inside, and the man followed close behind, locking the door once we were inside. The cabin was small, dimly lit, and smelled of old wood and dust. There was no furniture, just a single mattress on the floor and a table in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We'll be safe here for now," the man said, his voice steady but tired. "But we can't stay here long. We need to figure out what's going on." I looked at him, my heart heavy with doubt. "What do you mean? What's really happening?" The man hesitated before answering, his eyes flicking to the window, watching for movement. "There are people after Sophie," he said quietly. "People who don't care about anything but getting what they want. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do they want from her?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he replied. "But I have an idea. And it's not good." Sophie squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear. I pulled her closer to me, my mind racing. I had promised her we would be safe, but I didn't know how to keep that promise. The man stepped back from the window and turned to face us. "We'll figure this out," he said. "But for now, we need to stay quiet. We can't afford to be found." I nodded, holding Sophie close as the man moved to the door, checking the locks. The night stretched on, the silence pressing in on us as we waited, unsure of what was to come. But one thing was certain, we weren't safe yet, and the nightmare was far from over. I sat in the cold cabin, the silence pressing down on us like a heavy weight. Sophie was lying on the mattress in the corner, her small body curled up in the blanket, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I could see the exhaustion in her face, but there was something else too, fear. Fear of what was coming next. And I couldn't blame her. I felt the same way. The man who had been helping us, the one who had brought us here, was pacing back and forth by the window, his eyes constantly scanning the woods outside. He had been on edge since we arrived, but now I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. It was clear that something was wrong. We were not as safe as he had led us to believe. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting too long. I walked over to the window and stood beside him, trying to see what he saw. The woods outside were dark, the trees swaying in the wind, but there was nothing there. Nothing that I could see. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice low. He didn't answer right away. He was still watching the woods, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice tight. "But I can feel them. They're out there." I glanced at Sophie, who was still lying on the mattress, her eyes closed now, but I could tell she wasn't asleep. She was still listening, still waiting for something. "Anything. We can't just sit here and wait," I said, my voice sharp. "We need a plan. We need to know who's after us and why." The man turned to face me, his eyes hard. "I told you before. It's bigger than just some street thugs," he said, his voice low. "These people are dangerous. They've been after Sophie for a long time, and they won't stop until they get what they want." I felt my chest tighten. Sophie had been through so much already. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve any of it. "What do they want with her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to Sophie, then back to me. "I don't know exactly," he said, his voice grim. "But I have a feeling it's not just about money. It's something bigger, something darker." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. "I just wanted to protect her. I wanted to get her out of this." "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "We can't stay here. Not if they're coming for us." The man didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, like he was trying to figure something out. "Where would we go?" he asked finally. "Where can we go?" I thought about it for a moment. We couldn't stay in the cabin. We couldn't stay in this town. But where could we go? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know who to trust anymore. The world felt smaller with each passing second, like the walls were closing in on us. "We'll figure it out," I said finally. "We'll make it work." The man nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. "We need to move quickly," he said. "We're not safe here. Not anymore." I glanced at Sophie again, who was sitting up now, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. "We need to make sure she's okay," I said softly. The man looked at me, his expression unreadable. "She's been through a lot," he said. "But she's tough. She's stronger than you think." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I had to believe that Sophie could make it through this. I had to believe that we all could. We had no choice. The man moved toward the door, his hand resting on the knob. "We need to go now," he said. "There's no time to waste." I took one last look at Sophie before following him. We stepped out of the cabin, the cold night air hitting my skin like a slap. The woods around us were still, eerily quiet, but I knew it wouldn't last. We had to keep moving. The man led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. Sophie stayed close behind me, her small hand in mine, her steps quick but uncertain. I could feel her fear, and I hated that I couldn't do more to protect her. As we moved through the trees, the man stopped suddenly, his body tense. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He was listening, his head tilted to the side. "They're close," he said finally. "Too close." I looked around, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, like something was just waiting to pounce. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. The man didn't say anything, just motioned for us to keep moving. "We run," he said, his voice low and urgent. "And we don't stop." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Sophie was already ahead of me, her small legs moving as fast as she could. I kept pace with her, my hand gripping hers tightly. We had no time to waste. Whatever was out there, we had to outrun it. The man was already ahead of us, moving through the trees with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He turned back to look at us, his expression unreadable. "Don't look back," he said, his voice sharp. "Just keep moving." I nodded, my breath coming faster now. We were running, but for how long? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to protect Sophie, and I wasn't going to stop running until we were safe. I could hear the sound of our footsteps echoing through the trees, the leaves crunching beneath our boots as we pushed through the dense underbrush. The man was leading us, moving with a kind of practiced ease, while I struggled to keep up, my heart pounding in my chest. Sophie was close behind, her small body trembling with each step, but she kept moving, determined to stay with us. I could feel her fear, her uncertainty, but I couldn't stop now. We couldn't stop. We had to keep moving. I glanced around, the darkness of the forest pressing in on us from all sides. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, and the air felt thick, heavy with the threat of what was to come. I didn't know where we were going, but I trusted the man who was leading us. He had been right before. He knew how to survive. He knew how to keep us alive. Still, the silence was suffocating. My mind kept racing, going over everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. The men who had attacked us, the ones who had been after Sophie, what they wanted. It didn't make sense. Why was she the target? What had she seen? What did she know that had made her so important to them? I glanced over at Sophie, her face pale in the moonlight. She was walking quietly, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. She didn't speak, and I knew it was because she was scared, confused. I wanted to tell her everything was going to be okay, that we were safe now, but I couldn't make that promise. Not when I didn't know what was coming next. The man led us through the woods for what felt like hours, the darkness of the forest never letting up, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant sound of an animal moving through the trees. My legs were starting to ache, and I could feel the exhaustion setting in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, the man stopped in front of a large, old cabin, its wooden structure barely visible in the dark. He motioned for us to follow him as he approached the door. "We're here," he said in a low voice, his expression unreadable. I followed him, Sophie close behind me, my mind racing. I wasn't sure if this place was truly safe, but it was our only option. The man opened the door slowly, glancing around before stepping inside. I hesitated, looking back one last time to make sure no one was following us, but there was nothing. The woods were quiet again, the night still. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The cabin was dark, but there was a faint light coming from a small lamp in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the place feel a little less intimidating. Sophie walked in after me, her eyes wide as she looked around the room. It was sparse, with just a few old pieces of furniture and a small kitchen area in the back. There was a fireplace, but it was cold, and the air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of old wood. "We're safe here for now," the man said, closing the door behind him and locking it. "But we can't stay long. We need to figure out our next move." I nodded, my eyes scanning the room. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Sophie took a seat on the worn couch, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was something else too. something I hadn't seen before. A kind of quiet strength. Despite everything she had been through, she was still holding on. "What now?" I asked, turning to the man. He was standing near the window, peering out through the curtains. "We wait," he said. "They'll be looking for us, but they don't know where we are yet. We have a little time to regroup." I wasn't sure how much time we had, but it didn't feel like enough. My mind was racing, my thoughts spinning. I didn't know what we were running from, but I knew that we couldn't keep running forever. "What are we running from?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't look at me. He just stared out the window, his jaw clenched. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice tight. "But whoever is after you, they won't stop. They'll do anything to get to you. And we need to be ready for when they come." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do we do then?" He turned to face me, his eyes dark. "We fight. We don't run anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't sure I was ready to fight. I didn't know if I was capable of it. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let anyone hurt Sophie. Not again. I walked over to the fireplace, the flames crackling softly as I knelt down to start a fire. The warmth from the flames was comforting, but it didn't do much to ease the fear gnawing at my insides. Sophie was sitting on the couch, her eyes closed now, but I could still see the tension in her face. She was scared. We all were. "We'll be okay," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "We have to be." The man stood by the window, his eyes scanning the trees outside. I could see the weight of the situation settling on him too. We were all in this together now, and we didn't have any other choice but to fight. The quiet of the cabin felt like a temporary lull in the storm, but I knew it wouldn't last. Whoever was out there, they wouldn't stop. And neither would we. I sat by the fire, my eyes fixed on the crackling flames as they danced and flickered in the dark. The warmth was welcome, but it did little to ease the knot of anxiety in my chest. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled up under the blanket, her breathing steady but shallow. The man was standing by the window again, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the darkness outside like a hawk. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the silent unease in his every movement. We had only been here for a short time, but it already felt like we were on borrowed time. Every second that passed, I kept expecting someone to come crashing through the door, or worse, to find us out in the woods, vulnerable and exposed. The man's eyes flicked to me, and I could see the exhaustion in his face. "We need to move," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "Move? Where? What do you mean?" He turned fully toward me, his expression grim. "This place isn't safe. I told you before, they'll come for us. And they won't stop until they get what they want. We can't stay here any longer." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. The weight of everything that had happened since we ran into each other was starting to hit me harder than before. We had been running for days, hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of whoever was after Sophie. But now it felt like there was nowhere left to go. "So where do we go?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside me. "Do you have some place in mind?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were distant, focused on something outside the cabin that I couldn't see. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "There's a contact I know. He's a good man, but we need to be careful. If we're being tracked, and I think we are, the last thing we need is to be followed to someone we know." I could feel the weight of his words. Even though I barely knew this man, something in me told me he wasn't the kind to make rash decisions. He was the type of person who thought things through, who had survived long enough to know how to stay alive in a world full of threats. "How do we get to him?" I asked. "We'll have to move fast. There's no time to waste," he said, walking over to the small wooden table near the window and grabbing a few supplies. "We'll head out in the morning. Get some rest while you can. We don't know how long the next leg of the journey will be." I nodded, but sleep didn't come easily. The cabin felt too quiet, too still, and every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, made me tense up, wondering if it was them, the ones who were hunting us. I looked over at Sophie, her small body curled up under the blanket, her face pale in the dim light. I wanted so badly to shield her from this nightmare, to take her back to a time when she was safe, when she could laugh and play without fear. But that world was gone now. All I could do was protect her from the horrors that were coming. I stood up slowly, moving to the window to join the man. He was still staring into the night, his eyes scanning the shadows with a sharp, almost predatory focus. I could see the way his muscles were tense, like a coiled spring, ready to move at a moment's notice. "You think they're out there, don't you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at me, but I saw him nod slightly. "They've been tracking us since we left the motel. I don't know who they are, but they're too organized. Too precise. They won't give up easily." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "We can't outrun them, can we?" He finally turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine. "Not forever. But we can fight. And that's what we'll do." His words were simple, but they carried weight. A promise. A warning. I nodded, though my chest tightened with the knowledge that we were running out of options. We couldn't keep fighting forever. At some point, we would have to face them. I glanced back at Sophie, still sleeping, oblivious to the danger that was closing in around us. I hated the fact that she was so unaware, so innocent, while I had to shoulder the burden of keeping her safe. The man walked over to the small kitchen area and began rummaging through a bag. "We'll leave at dawn. We'll head straight for my contact. He's the best chance we have of getting you both out of this," he said, not looking up. I nodded again, though the fear still gnawed at me. "How long do you think we have?" I asked. The man stopped for a moment, his gaze flicking toward the door. "Not long. They're closing in. They know we're here. We'll need to move quickly." I turned back to the window, my mind racing. There was no time left to waste. We had to get out. We had to keep moving. The cabin felt smaller by the second, like the walls were closing in on us, trapping us in a fight we didn't know how to win. But we had to fight. We had to keep Sophie safe. And as long as I was breathing, I would make sure no one took her from me. I turned to the man, my voice steady. "Let's do this." He looked at me for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we move." As I lay down beside Sophie, my mind raced, but my body was too exhausted to stay awake. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The storm outside had passed, but the one that was coming would be far worse. And I wasn't sure we were ready for it. I woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside, the cabin creaking under the pressure of the storm. It was early morning, and the faint light filtering through the cracks in the walls was the only indication that a new day had begun. I glanced over at Sophie, still asleep on the mattress beside me, her small body curled up under the blanket. She looked peaceful, but I knew that peace wouldn't last long. We couldn't stay here any longer. The man was already up, moving around the cabin with a quiet urgency. He was packing up supplies, his face set in determination. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building in my chest. We had made it this far, but I could sense that we were nearing the end of our luck. The man turned to me as I got up, his eyes tired but focused. "It's time," he said simply. I nodded, trying to push the growing anxiety out of my mind. We had to move, no matter what. I gently shook Sophie awake, and she stirred, blinking up at me with confusion. "We're going now, sweetheart," I said softly. "We have to keep moving." She nodded, sitting up slowly. Her face was still pale, her eyes heavy with sleep, but she didn't argue. She had learned to trust me, and I could see the quiet resolve in her eyes. We had been through so much already, and she knew that we had no choice but to keep going. I helped her get up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and we followed the man outside. The wind hit us immediately, biting at our skin, but there was no time to waste. The man led the way, walking quickly through the trees, the path barely visible in the dim morning light. Sophie stayed close to me, her small hand gripping mine tightly as we walked. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness of the forest. I kept my eyes scanning the surroundings, my heart hammering in my chest. We had to get to the safe house, but I had no idea what would be waiting for us there. My mind kept replaying the events of the past few days, the attacks, the people chasing us, and the constant fear that had followed us everywhere. We had barely survived each encounter, and I wasn't sure how many more we could endure. The man moved ahead of us, his pace steady but quick. I could see the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the knowledge that we were running out of time pressing on him as much as it was on me. We kept moving, the forest stretching on in every direction, the sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. I glanced at Sophie again, her face still pale, but she was holding it together. I had to give her credit. She was stronger than I had realized. After what felt like hours, we finally emerged from the trees, the cabin where the man had planned to take us just up ahead. The building was old, weathered by time and neglect, but it looked sturdy. We were close. The man led us inside, his eyes darting around the area as if expecting someone to jump out at us at any moment. The cabin was dark, with only a few rays of sunlight filtering in through the cracks in the walls. The air was damp, the smell of mildew filling the room. It wasn't much, but it was better than the forest. Sophie went to the corner and sat down on the floor, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. I went to the window, peering out through the blinds, trying to make sure we weren't being followed. The man moved to the table, pulling out a small map and spreading it out in front of him. He pointed to a spot on the map. "This is where we need to go next," he said, his voice low. I moved closer, trying to get a better look. "What's there?" I asked. "A place to hide," he replied simply. "A place where we can wait until things die down." I looked at him, my stomach tightening. We couldn't just hide forever. We had to find a way to end this, to stop running. But for now, there was nothing else we could do. "How long will we be there?" I asked. "As long as it takes," he said, not looking at me. "But we can't stay here long. We need to keep moving. If they find us, it's over." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. "We'll be ready." The man turned to me, his eyes serious. "It's not just about being ready," he said. "It's about survival. And right now, survival is the only thing that matters." I didn't respond. What was there to say? He was right. Sophie's safety was all that mattered now. I glanced at her, her small body hunched over, her hands wrapped tightly around her knees. She was exhausted, but I knew she wouldn't stop. She had come this far, and she was stronger than I had ever realized. I walked over to her and sat down beside her. "We're going to get through this," I said softly, my hand resting on her shoulder. She looked up at me, her eyes full of uncertainty, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, leaning into me slightly. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant running. But I wasn't going to let it break me. We had made it this far, and we would keep going, no matter what it took. We would survive. The man moved to the door, his hand on the knob. He looked back at us one last time before stepping outside. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "We're not safe yet." I stood up and turned to Sophie, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let's go, sweetheart," I said. "We're not done yet." We stepped outside into the morning light, the world ahead of us still uncertain, but I wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever.